On a clear afternoon in Fairview, Virginia, a black teenager steps into a fine jewelry store, eager to buy a special gift for his little sister, something he saved for through honest, hard work. But his excitement fades when the clerk meets him with a cold, suspicious stare, judging him before he even speaks. Then a simple accident changes everything. The bracelet he's admiring slips from his fingers, hits the floor with a sharp chime, and in an instant, the clerk accuses him of theft. The police arrive within minutes, handcuffs at the ready, assuming guilt without question, just as it seems he's trapped by this injustice. The door opens. A woman steps forward, calm, dignified, carrying an air of undeniable authority, and with one bold declaration, she shatters their assumptions, turning the entire situation on its head. It was a pleasant Saturday afternoon in Fairview, Virginia, a small town just outside the bustle of Washington, D.C., where the sun cast a warm glow over tidy lawns and familiar faces. Families strolled through the park, children's laughter ringing out from the playground, while neighbors exchanged easy conversation on their way to the local market. It was the kind of day that felt simple, predictable, a peaceful backdrop to the lives of decent, hard-working people who called this place home. But for one black teenager, this Saturday carried a deeper meaning. He was on a mission to buy a birthday gift for his little sister, something special, something that showed how much she meant to him. He had spent months saving every dollar from his part-time job, taking quiet pride in each paycheck that brought him closer to affording the silver bracelet he knew she would cherish. This wasn't just about shopping, it was about proving something. To her, to himself, maybe even to a world that didn't always see him the way he saw himself. Even so, a quiet unease lingered, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but one he had known before. Stepping into a fine jewelry store meant stepping into a space where glances could shift, where warmth could turn to wariness in an instant. He told himself today would be different. It had to be. As the black teenager approached the jewelry store in Fairview, the afternoon sun gleamed off its spotless windows, offering a glimpse into a world of quiet luxury, elegant, untouchable. He paused just outside, smoothing down his jacket. Not because he had anything to hide, but because he understood the unspoken rules. Looking respectable wasn't always enough, but it helped. He had seen it before. Those fleeting glances that measured him unfairly, assumptions made before he even spoke a word. He pushed the thought aside, or at least tried to, but it clung to him like a shadow. Taking a steady breath, he pulled open the heavy door. A soft bell chimed, crisp and clear, announcing his presence. Inside, the store was even grander than he'd imagined. Rows of glass cases shimmered with gold and silver, every surface polished to a gleam under the bright clinical lights. It was a place of quiet elegance, a place where everything had its place, a place that, for all its beauty, made him feel like he didn't quite belong. Behind the counter stood the clerk, a middle-aged woman with a stiff posture and watchful eyes. A moment ago she had been adjusting a display, her face blank, indifferent. But as he stepped forward, something in her shifted. Her hands stilled, her mouth tightened, and in that instant he felt it, that unspoken judgment settling in the air between them. She didn't know him. He hadn't even spoken. But he knew that look, had felt it before. A quiet wall, built in an instant, separating him from the space around him. And no matter how politely he carried himself, no matter how careful his steps, she had already decided who he was, or at least who she believed he ought to be. The black teenager stood inside the jewelry store, the clerk's stare pressing down on him like a weight. She didn't say it out loud, but he could hear the question in her eyes. "What's someone like you doing in a place like this?" He'd felt that judgment before, too many times, but he kept his expression steady. He wasn't here to prove anything, just to buy a gift for his sister. Squaring his shoulders, he stepped up to the counter and spoke, his voice polite and even. "I'd like to see that bracelet, please." He pointed to the one he had saved for, hoping, just for once, he'd be treated like any other customer. The clerk didn't move right away. She crossed her arms, her eyes scanning him with open skepticism before her lips pursed into a frown. "That's a pricey piece," she said, her tone sharp, as if the very idea of him affording it was absurd. "Are you sure you can pay for it?" It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a quiet accusation wrapped in doubt. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the neatly folded bills, money earned from months of honest work. "I've got the cash right here," he said, holding it up, his voice measured but firm. Her eyes flicked to the money, but instead of easing, her expression hardened. Her lips curled in faint disdain, and when she spoke again, her words were slower, pointed. "That's a lot of cash for a young man like you," she mused, her voice dripping with something cold. "Where'd you get it? Did you earn it, or did it just come your way?" The accusation wasn't subtle. It sat between them, heavy and unmistakable. His jaw tightened. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he held his ground. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low but steady, though the sting of it was impossible to ignore. He took a breath, keeping his hands loose at his sides. "I work part-time at the cafe down the street," he said, deliberate now, as if presenting evidence in a trial. "I saved for this." It was the truth. Every dollar, every shift, every late night. And he shouldn't have had to prove it. But the way she raised an eyebrow, the dismissive hum she let slip, told him she didn't believe a word. The clerk let out a dry huff, shaking her head like she'd caught him in a lie he hadn't told. "Well," she said, smug now, as if she'd already made up her mind, "I've been here long enough to know when something doesn't add up." His fingers twitched at his sides, but he forced them to relax. He'd come here for a simple transaction, nothing more, but she'd turned it into something else. A test, a judgment, and with every word she spoke, the sting of that injustice cut deeper. The black teenager stood at the counter, carefully lifting the bracelet to admire how it caught the light, just right for his sister. His grip slipped for only a second, and the silver piece tumbled from his fingers, landing on the floor with a soft clink. The sound shouldn't have meant anything. It was just an accident, but in the heavy silence of the store, it rang out like an alarm. His breath caught. He hadn't done anything wrong. But before he could even bend down to retrieve it, the clerk's sharp cry split the air. "I knew it," she shrieked, her voice slicing through the quiet, turning every head in his direction. "You were going to steal it, weren't you? Thought you could just slip it out." The words struck like a slap. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask. She just decided, like that. His pulse pounded in his ears as a wave of shock and disbelief crashed over him. "No," he started, his voice tight, trying to explain. But the damage was already done. The clerk lunged for the phone, her movements quick, frantic, like she'd caught him in the act. "Get the police here right now," she barked into the receiver. "We've got a thief, young guy, trying to rob us blind." Young guy. She didn't say black. She didn't have to. The message was clear enough. A hush settled over the store, thick with suspicion. The other customers had stopped in their tracks, their stares pressing down on him, their silence just as damning as her words. His hands trembled at his sides, his throat tightened. This wasn't happening. It was just a mistake, a moment, a slip. But now it was something else, and no matter how unfair it was, he knew the truth. Once she'd made up her mind, his side of the story didn't matter. The wail of sirens cut through the quiet Fairview afternoon, growing louder with every second. The black teenager stood frozen, his stomach twisting into knots. He'd heard those sounds before, on TV, in stories whispered between friends, and he knew how quickly things could go wrong for someone like him. His mind screamed at him to do something, to argue, to run. But he forced himself still, hands at his sides, breathing slow. Steady. He hadn't stolen anything, hadn't even thought of it. But the clerk's accusation had already set the wheels in motion, and now he was trapped in a story she had written for him. The clerk clutched the phone like a lifeline, her voice sharp with urgency. "Yes, hurry, he's still here, acting all innocent, but I saw him try to take it." Each word was a match tossed onto dry kindling, and she spoke with the confidence of someone who knew she would be believed. She glanced his way, her lips curling with satisfaction, while the other customers edged back. One woman clutched her purse tighter. A man shook his head, his disappointment heavy. Not one of them asked questions. Not one of them doubted her. "I didn't take anything," the teenager said, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. "You saw it fall. That's all." But the clerk scoffed, waving him off like his words meant nothing. "Don't try that with me. I know what people like you do. Come in here acting like customers, then walk out with whatever you can grab." The sting of it cut deep. Not just the accusation, but the certainty in her voice, like his guilt wasn't a question, like it had been decided before he even walked through the door. The store's front door swung open with a forceful thud, and 2 police officers stepped inside. The older one, broad and stiff-backed, moved in first, his gaze locking onto the teenager like a target. His hand hovered near his cuffs. The younger officer hung back, his expression unreadable, but the hesitation in his step said enough. He wasn't sure yet. "There he is," the clerk cried, her finger jabbing through the air. "I caught him red-handed." The older officer's eyes narrowed. He didn't ask questions, didn't look around, he just saw a suspect. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered, his voice flat, final. The teenager hesitated, his palms damp. He knew better than to move too fast. Carefully he raised his hands, forcing his breath to stay even. "I didn't do anything," he said again, this time louder. The clerk folded her arms, smirking like it was all settled. "Sure you didn't." The weight of it all, the sirens, the stares, the clerk's knowing smirk, pressed in from every side. The teenager clenched his jaw, his pulse roaring in his ears. Then he inhaled, steady and slow. "No, not like this. I need you to call my mother," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The older officer's brow creased. "You'll get your call downtown, kid." But the teenager didn't back down. "No, call her now." The clerk let out a dry laugh. "Oh, that's rich. Calling for backup? What's she gonna do, talk you out of this?" She thought she had him cornered, thought the story would end the way she expected. But he reached into his pocket, slow and careful, and pressed the call button with steady fingers, because he knew something she didn't. His mother wasn't just backup. She was the one person who could turn this nightmare upside down. The store door swung open again. This time, the air shifted. A woman stepped inside, tall, poised, her every movement deliberate. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate. She didn't have to. The quiet strength in her steps commanded attention before she even spoke. She wore a dark blazer, crisp and professional, her expression unreadable. And then, in one smooth motion, she reached into her pocket and held up a badge. The polished metal caught the store's bright lights, gleaming like a verdict. "This is my son." Her voice rang clear, steady. The words were simple, but they landed like a gavel strike. Silence followed, thick and absolute. The older officer stiffened, his fingers twitching near his cuffs, his certainty faltering for the first time. The younger officer exhaled, his shoulders loosening as if he'd been waiting for a reason to pause. And the clerk? Her face drained of smugness in an instant. The satisfaction, the righteousness, gone. In its place, a flicker of something close to panic. Her eyes darted from the badge to the teenager, then back again, scrambling to make sense of how quickly her story had crumbled. The teenager felt the shift too. Relief flooded him, though the hurt still burned beneath it. But this moment wasn't his to fix. It belonged to his mother now. She turned to the officers, her gaze sharp, measured. "Is there a reason," she asked, her tone cool but edged with steel, "why my son is standing here with cuffs almost on his wrists before you've even heard his side?" The older officer squared his shoulders, his stance stiff. "We got a call about a theft, ma'am," he said, clipped, defensive. Her head tilted slightly, just enough. "So you walked in, saw a young black man, and figured that was enough?" The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They cut through the room all the same. And this time, No one answered right away. The clerk jolted back into motion, her voice rising, sharp with desperation. "He was stealing," she insisted, jabbing a trembling finger at the black teenager. "I saw him trying to slip that bracelet away. I stopped him just in time." The accusation hung in the air, but its weight had shifted. It no longer carried certainty, only the frantic grasp of someone clinging to a crumbling lie. The teenager met his mother's gaze, his jaw tight, frustration simmering beneath his steady exterior. He didn't need to defend himself. Her presence alone spoke volumes. She saw everything: the quiet pain behind his restraint, the familiar exhaustion of being judged unfairly. Her voice, measured but firm, cut through the thick tension. "Have you checked the security cameras?" she asked, her eyes locking onto the older officer. A simple question, yet it landed like a challenge. He hesitated, shifting his stance, his authority suddenly less certain. "We were about to, ma'am," he muttered, but the words rang hollow. "Too little, too late." The woman's expression didn't change, but her tone sharpened. "No, you weren't. You were ready to cuff my son based on nothing but an accusation. No proof, no due diligence, just an assumption." Her words struck their mark, exposing the flaw in their judgment with precision that left no room for denial. The clerk's face twisted, her voice climbing in pitch. "You don't need cameras, I saw it. Why are you even listening to her?" she snapped, waving a dismissive hand, as if the woman's authority was something she could brush aside. But the woman didn't flinch. She met the clerk's glare with unshaken composure, her silence more cutting than any raised voice. Then, in a tone that was quiet but weighted, she said, "You accused a boy who walked in to buy a gift. You decided he didn't belong before he even spoke. And if those cameras prove you wrong, you'll have to answer for it." The words landed with the force of a verdict, and for the first time, the clerk faltered. Her confidence wavered under the cold light of accountability. The younger officer, standing rigid at his partner's side, finally spoke, his voice careful but firm. "We should check the footage," he said, stealing a glance at the older officer. A flash of irritation crossed the senior cop's face, but he said nothing. He couldn't argue, not now, not with her standing there, unwavering. The store manager, who had been hovering nervously in the background, shuffled forward, fumbling with the computer. A moment later, the screen flickered to life, and there it was, clear as day. The teenager stepping in, polite and patient, asking for the bracelet, pulling out his money. The brief fumble, the bracelet slipping, falling, no quick hands, no theft, no intent to steal. Just an honest mistake. The proof stood undeniable, stark against the accusations that had been hurled so easily. A heavy silence fell over the room. The younger officer exhaled, rubbing a tense hand over his face, as if relieved to see the truth at last. The older officer remained rigid, his jaw tight, his pride visibly stung by how wrong they had been. But it was the clerk who looked the smallest of all. She stared at the screen, her arms falling limply to her sides, her certainty stripped away. The force of her conviction had built this entire confrontation, but now, with the truth exposed, all that remained was the weight of her own prejudice. The woman turned back to the officers, her voice like tempered steel. "So?" she said, eyes unwavering. "Are you still planning to arrest my son?" The older officer said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was its own admission. Then she turned to the clerk. "And you?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "Now that the truth is right there for everyone to see, what do you have to say?" The clerk's mouth opened, then closed again. No words came. The teenager watched it all unfold, his chest loosening just a fraction. Relief, yes, but it was tangled with something bitter. The quiet sting of knowing he had been forced to prove his innocence when it should have never been in question at all. The black teenager and his mother stepped out of the jewelry store, the glass door swinging shut behind them with a muted thud, sealing off the tension they left inside. The afternoon sun still bathed Fairview in warm light, but it didn't feel the same, not after what had happened. He inhaled deeply, trying to loosen the tight knot in his chest, but the weight of being wrongly accused clung to him, heavy and unshakable. Beside him, his mother walked with quiet composure, her face calm, but her eyes carrying a sharp, simmering anger. Not loud, not reckless, but the kind that lingered after witnessing something deeply unjust. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice softer now, a mother's voice, meant to steady rather than challenge. He hesitated, then glanced back at the store where the clerk still stood behind the counter, stiff and pale, watching them through the glass. "I don't know," he admitted, his words raw and honest. "I should feel good she was wrong and everyone saw it, but it still hurts. It shouldn't have happened at all." His mother nodded, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're right," she said. "You shouldn't have to prove your innocence just to be treated fairly. That's their failure, not yours." The door creaked open again. The clerk stepped out, clutching her purse tight against her side. She hesitated a few feet away, her gaze flicking between the teenager and his mother, her lips parting slightly like she might speak. He waited, half expecting, half hoping for an apology, though deep down, he already knew better. The moment stretched, brittle with unspoken words. Then, without saying a thing, she just shook her head and turned, walking briskly down the sidewalk, as if distance could erase what had happened. Her silence spoke louder than any excuse could. The officers emerged next. The older one kept his gaze down, nodding once, short, stiff, perfunctory, before heading straight for his car. No words, no acknowledgement, just an exit. The younger officer lingered for a second longer, shifting on his feet, his hands fidgeting at his sides. He glanced their way, an awkward, fleeting look somewhere between regret and discomfort, then followed his partner without another word. The teenager exhaled sharply, his shoulders sinking. "They didn't even say anything," he muttered, the absence of an apology stinging more than the accusation itself. His mother's grip on his shoulder tightened. "Some people don't have the courage to admit when they're wrong," she said, her voice steady, carrying the weight of experience. He turned away from the store, from the clerk, from the officers who had already moved on. The customers inside had gone back to browsing as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just been dragged through something he never should have faced. "I just wanted to buy a bracelet," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Such a simple thing, such an ordinary act, and yet it had turned into this. His mother sighed, keeping her hand on him, grounding him. "I know," she said, her voice soft but firm, a promise and a truth all at once. "And you deserved better than this." The black teenager sank into the car seat, the door clicking shut beside him. The quiet hum of the engine filled the space, steady but subdued, a contrast to the storm still lingering inside him. He leaned back, staring at the dashboard, the weight of the day pressing down. Every word, every glance, every moment from that store still clinging to him like dust he couldn't shake off. His mother sat beside him, fingers tightening briefly around the steering wheel before she forced them to relax. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence wasn't empty, it was thick with everything they just endured. A son unfairly accused, a mother who had to step in to demand the truth. She turned to him, her voice softer now, no longer carrying the sharp edge it had inside. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, warmth in her tone but also something heavier, worry, the kind that didn't fade once the moment had passed. He shifted, his hands restless on his lap, then let out a slow breath. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "I'm mad, tired too, and it's not just today. It's knowing that tomorrow someone else is going to go through the same thing, and no one's going to care." His words sat between them, heavy with the truth of a world that too often refused to see. She exhaled quietly, looking straight ahead, her jaw tightening just a fraction before she spoke. "I know it's hard," she said, her voice measured, thoughtful. "It's wrong that it keeps happening, but today you stood your ground. You didn't let them decide who you were." She turned to him then, her gaze steady. "That matters, even if they don't see it." He frowned, eyes drifting to the window, watching the streets of Fairview blur past. "It doesn't feel like enough," he muttered. "I shouldn't have to fight just to be seen as a person." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate. He watched, eyebrows lifting slightly as she dialed a number and spoke with calm authority. "Yes, I need a statement drafted today about what happened at the jewelry store," she said, her voice firm again. "I want a full review of that call to the police and a public acknowledgement of how wrong it was to judge someone like that. Make sure it's clear." She glanced at him as she spoke, and in her eyes he caught a flicker of something. Determination? Maybe even defiance. "You're not letting this go?" he asked, a hint of surprise cutting through his exhaustion. She met his gaze, unwavering. Not a chance. For the first time that day, something stronger than hurt settled in his chest, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this fight wasn't his alone. Days later, the jewelry store in Fairview was all over the news, TV reports, online articles, and opinion pieces dissecting what had happened that Saturday afternoon. The store released a statement, clear and firm, a commitment to fairness, a promise to review the officer's hasty response, and an acknowledgement that the clerk's call had been unfounded. Word spread quickly. Some said she had been let go, others whispered she was quietly fired. Either way, the damage was done. The store's reputation took a hit, a stark reminder that actions, especially unjust ones, carry consequences. The black teenager sat on his couch, scrolling through headlines on his phone, his thumb pausing over each one. He should have felt satisfied. Justice in some form had been served, but instead a different thought pressed against him, heavy and unshakable. How close had it come to going the other way, if his mother hadn't been there, if the cameras hadn't been checked, if no one had bothered to listen? The question lodged deep, a quiet ache no news story could ease. He'd done nothing wrong, had simply walked in to buy a gift, and yet he still had to fight to prove himself. The weight of that truth lingered, sharper than any victory. A sudden, cheerful voice cut through his thoughts. "Look at this!" His little sister bounded into the room, her wrist flashing with the silver bracelet he had picked out. She held it up, grinning, her eyes bright with delight, completely unaware of the trouble it had caused. "It's so pretty! I love it!" she said, spinning it around her wrist, excitement bubbling in her voice. He forced a smile, nodding. "I'm glad." What he didn't say was that he hadn't gone back to get it. His mother had, sparing him the return. "You picked it out?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yeah," he said simply. "That's what counts." She threw her arms around him in a quick, tight hug before racing off, her joy filling the space like sunlight cutting through a storm. He watched her go, exhaling slowly. The knot in his chest loosened, just a little. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the full fairness he deserved, wasn't an end to the bigger problem, but her happiness was real, untouched by the weight of what had happened. And for now, that small win was something he could hold on to. A moment of decency in a day that had tried to take so much. But the story didn't fade. People kept talking about it, sharing it, turning it into more than just a headline. It became a call to pay attention, to think before judging, to treat people with the fairness they deserved. For the teenager and his mother, it wasn't just a news cycle. It was a stand they had taken together, a push against a wrong that should never have been theirs to fix. And for those who read it, who passed it along, who let it settle in their minds, maybe it became something more, a lesson carried forward, a promise to do better, not just for them, but for anyone who had ever faced the same unfair fight and deserved better. The story in Fairview is not unique. Every day, all over the world, quick judgments, unconscious biases, and injustices take place. In stores, on the streets, in schools, and even in workplaces. Sometimes, like the teenager in Fairview, there is clear evidence to prove the truth. But not everyone is lucky enough to have a mother who will stand up for them, a camera to capture what really happened, or a crowd willing to listen. That's why this story is more than just a personal lesson. It is a reminder about fairness, about how society treats those most vulnerable, and about the responsibility we all share. It raises a simple but important question. If we were in that mother's position, would we dare to speak up? If we were bystanders, would we have the courage to act? Big changes start with small actions. a more open-minded look, a fairer word, or a choice to stand up against what is wrong. Because in the end, justice is not just someone else's responsibility, it belongs to all of us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more exciting stories every day. See you in the next one.